Hello, my name is Michael Dwan Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach in private practice in London. I have concern about how woke psychotherapy, as informed by critical social justice theory, has impacted the training of therapists and the practice of psychotherapy. In this series, under the title Questioning Woke Psychotherapy, I've had two intentions. One is to provide a critique of woke psychotherapy, but the other is to preserve its good intentions and its valid points. In this video, I'd like to take a step back and ask the question, how is it that it's been so persuasive for so many people and had such an impact on the field, not to mention the world at large? In order to answer that question, I'll be examining woke psychotherapy in terms of some strategies of propaganda that it uses to get its message out and spread in the world. Before I start, I want to stop and be as clear as I possibly can about what I mean by the word propaganda, so that it won't seem that I'm casting a vague accusation at woke psychotherapy, perhaps a form of propaganda itself. The word goes back early Catholic Church, and we saw great examples of it in the 20th century in terms of communism rising in both Russia and China. We saw it in Nazi Germany. We've seen it in the pumping up of patriotism in any country, which can become a justification for war. We've seen it in the political campaigns of candidates for office. We see it in advertising. It's really ubiquitous. It's around us. We're swimming in propaganda all the time. People are trying to persuade us to buy or do something. And it's a really good idea to be aware of how this is done. I don't have time in this video to examine the whole history and all of that, but I want to just acknowledge that. In any case, wherever we see propaganda, what we see is the systematic and ultimately deceptive effort to manipulate other people's beliefs, emotions, attitudes, and behavior by means of symbols. This is both language and images and anything that communicates a meaning. Propaganda can be both overt and covert, meaning that overt is straightforward. It tells you that it's trying to persuade you of something. For instance, a news broadcast or article will perhaps criticize a public figure, and in that's the overt part. The covert part might be providing an image of that person in an unflattering light. This can go the other way. You can make a positive statement about a public figure and provide a really lovely picture of them. So there's both overt and covert forms of propaganda. In addition to overt and covert forms of propaganda, there's also conscious and unconsciously practiced propaganda. Consciously practiced propaganda is when one knows an untruth or a deception is being offered, and that you're deliberately trying to manipulate somebody. Unconscious propaganda is when you believe it yourself. You've been convinced of it, you've lied to yourself, whatever. You think what you're saying is the truth, and you're trying to persuade others of it. And you will engage in many of the forms of propaganda that I'll be talking about shortly, but you're not doing it deliberately to manipulate people. You feel that you're just trying to persuade them. So along with defining as clear as I can what I think propaganda means, I want to distinguish or separate it from straightforward persuasion or a rhetorical argument, which is an attempt to influence people, have them think and feel and do things, but it's more straightforward and it's more rooted in truth and fact. And it's also open to questioning. And this is the other part of propaganda that I want to mention, is you can be pretty sure that you're hitting propaganda when you raise a question or a doubt or you have a criticism, that it's very defensive. It will deny. It will do anything but contend with a disagreement. Opponents must be smeared and canceled. More on that later. Okay, now hopefully with a clear understanding of what the word propaganda can mean, I want to identify what it is that woke psychotherapy, through critical social justice theory, would like to persuade us of. What is it that it wants us to believe? I want to identify 4 primary tenets of critical social justice. These are the fundamental things that I believe it would like to persuade us of, and that it will employ propaganda in order to do it. The first tenet is that group identity is primary and trumps individual identity. The second tenet is that groups can be divided in a binary way between the oppressed and the oppressor. The third tenet is that these two groups are locked in a perpetual zero-sum power struggle for dominance. And the fourth tenet is a little more complicated, but it has to do with truth claims, that in this competition there will be truth claims made on both sides. And critical social justice adheres usually to a postmodern view that there is no such thing as an objective truth, that all truths are socially constructed, and that they're constructed for the purpose of gaining dominance and control. And so they defer to the validity of lived experience, sometimes it's called standpoint epistemology. And that means that the one who can be identified to be in the oppressed group is true and valid. That's the point of view that we should give credibility to. And there's no objective truth as a reference point for making any criticisms legitimate if it's coming from a dominant group. Critical social justice has pointed out and complained about systemic forms of oppression through language and ideas and institutions, challenging any exercises of power. At the same time, it has inserted itself through language and ideas and institutions and gained power and instrumental control in many ways of several institutions, from education to media to corporations to law, and is exerting its own power. Perhaps ironic. Okay, so how does it do this? I will now provide some examples of how it does this through propaganda. There's a lot more forms of propaganda that I won't be talking about, but a few might be good enough. And for each one, for sake of brevity, I will only offer maybe 1, maybe 2 examples of each one. The first tactic is called cherry picking, and that is to present only information that supports and confirms your own perspective and your own claim, and to omit anything that would contradict it. For instance, from a feminist perspective, to support the idea that we live in an oppressive patriarchal society where women are disadvantaged, the proverbial gender pay gap is presented, that women make 70 cents for every dollar a man makes. What is not presented is that when a multivariate analysis is done on this gap and many other factors are considered, that gap all but disappears, and along with it, any notion that that difference has anything to do with discrimination. Also, in order to make its argument about male privilege, feminism will point out all of the ways that women struggle, may be disadvantaged or burdened by society, and therefore why it's important to have a campaign for gender equality. What it doesn't mention isn't confirming of its argument are things like this. 70% of homeless population is men. 94% of workplace deaths are men. 70% of homicide victims are men. 70% of suicide deaths are men. 90% of military deaths are men. On average, men have a shorter lifespan. Some studies have shown that up to 40% of domestic violence victims are men, and that women initiate violence domestically more often than men do. And men are more often sentenced to prison than women for the same crime and receive longer sentences. These are just some. There are many other details like this. These are not presented. What's cherry-picked is everything that makes the claim of the oppressive patriarchy. What's not mentioned is the way men also struggle and are disadvantaged. The next tactic of propaganda I want to talk about is framing, which means to interpret events through the lens of your own ideology or narrative and rejecting equally plausible interpretations that might even be better. Following the tragic murder of George Floyd by police officer Derek Chauvin on May 25, 2020, protests and riots swept the U.S., resulting in $2 billion worth of damage. Floyd's death, caught on video, was one more in a series of fatalities for black people at the hands of police officers. This was framed as the gut-wrenching, heartbreaking evidence of an endemic problem, of the disproportionate and racially motivated killing of black people by police. This is a very emotionally compelling argument, and it swept the world. Before I go on, I want to pause and just acknowledge that. There's a profound pain in all of that. However, there was no evidence that Chauvin's actions were motivated by racial prejudice. That was assumed. No evidence for it. However, and more importantly, the series of deaths of black people at the hands of police, as abhorrent and emotionally disturbing as it is anecdotal. And anecdotal evidence is not sufficient to make a claim of a disproportionate problem, that black people are disproportionately killed compared to white people by police. Black Harvard economist Roland Fryer got curious about this and wanted to see if he could show that there was disproportionality, and conducted research. And he was surprised by the results. He didn't expect it. When he controlled for multiple variables, what he found was that there was no disproportionality. In fact, if anything, whites were killed more frequently than blacks. This casts some doubt on the frame provided by Black Lives Matter and critical social justice about this, and suggests that there may be another way to see it, and that perhaps instead of racism being the problem, maybe the problem is the recruitment and the training of police officers. And perhaps if that was targeted as the solution to the problem, we would get further than burning down cities. Of course, this flies in the face of a rejection of objective truth and an embrace of social constructions where subjective experiences and interpretation are supreme. On that basis, Fryer's findings can only be seen as fodder for white supremacy, and Fryer himself to be seen as enacting whiteness despite his black body. Again, the supremacy of lived experience and the deferral to standpoint epistemology. The next tactic of propaganda I call changing and controlling language, sometimes called concept creep. Over time, we've seen how critical social justice has changed the meaning of words. It has invented new words. It has found ways to exact a high price for the use of language that it disapproves of. This has quite an impact on what we think and how we think and what we're able to talk about publicly. Racism. Racism used to mean the prejudice for or against somebody based solely on the color of their skin. Now, most of us understand that it must be joined with power, with the ability to oppress or marginalize another group. I think that that's an important thing to add, but what this has done is freed up a minority group or a marginalized group to engage in and promote all kinds of prejudice, from minor forms all the way up to the most dramatic that I'm aware of, which is the calling for the killing of all white people. Phobia. Phobia used to mean an irrational fear of something. Now it seems to simply mean somebody who disagrees with or challenges or questions an accepted dogma or position, that you're transphobic, you're Islamophobic, you're xenophobic, when in fact there may be no fear whatsoever. There's no irrational fear. There's just a question or a critique of an idea. Hate. This used to mean an intense dislike, contempt for somebody or for some group. Now, like phobia, it means disagreement. It means that if you have brought into question any of the ideology or any of the ideas of critical social justice, you're engaging in hate speech. Anti-racist. This wasn't a very commonly used phrase before. I don't know if it's a new word or a twist on just simply not believing in racism. It used to be that if you were an anti-racist, you simply didn't subscribe to racist beliefs. Now, to be an anti-racist, you have to devote your life in an active way to the perpetual fighting against all forms of racism. You're either a racist or an anti-racist. Violence. Violence used to refer to physical attacks that caused injury. Now, violence is included as what we can do with language, and microaggressions are an act of violence. Sexual harassment. It seems once upon a time this meant a particularly aggressive form of sexual advancement between one person and another. Now it seems to include a lot of subtle things, things that wouldn't have been considered sexual harassment before. Another term that's been made up is the male gaze, that a man could be accused of sexual harassment simply for looking at a woman. In some cases, even asking a woman out on a date might be considered a form of sexual harassment, particularly if she's not attracted to the man who's asking her. Trauma. We used to use the word trauma to refer to profoundly disturbing physical events that resulted in injury or emotionally damaging events that caused great emotional harm. Now, simply being offended or ignored can trigger an experience of trauma, as if there's been an existentially life-threatening event that has caused one trauma. Gender. Okay, once the word gender referred to male and female, or man and woman. Now, I don't think anybody knows what it means. We're in a state of great confusion with the proliferation of what it might mean when one says gender. These terms and others like them seem to amplify the despicable nature of the perceived oppressive group, as well as the injury and the negative consequences suffered by the oppressed group. In addition to the changing of the meaning of words that we have used all along, there is a big lexicon of words that are new, that were introduced to us by critical social justice. And I'm just going to read some of them off here I'm not going to explain each one, but you may recognize many of them. Intersectionality, cisnormativity, heteronormativity, microaggressions, cultural appropriation, safe spaces, trigger warnings, white fragility, TERFs, trans-exclusionary radical feminists, people who menstruate, and my favorite is fellow logocentrism. So we've got a lot more words to learn to inform our thinking. Don't get me wrong, I think new words need to be invented all the time to describe things that we need to be more aware of, and so there's a use for these things. But I would point out that all of these words serve the agenda and the ideology of critical social justice. The next tactic of propaganda I would call oversimplification. The main oversimplification, which I've identified before, is the reduction of individuals to their group identity and not recognizing the complex and rich variation that makes up an individual's identity. Further, again, as I've mentioned before, is reducing groups that have been identified into this binary of oppressor and oppressed. That's a simplification of human relations to one dynamic. It does not explain everything. And further, again, as I've said, it's the simplification of the relation between these two groups as a zero-sum game and a struggle for power. It seems that this oversimplification of human beings and human relations is at the heart of critical social justice ideological agenda. The piling up of evidence, the framing of every situation in these terms, the manipulation of language, the manipulation of emotions, it's all aimed at driving the stake as deeply into the ground as possible. The next tactic, scapegoating. Critical social justice requires a scapegoat. Social inequalities must be blamed on someone or some group. The misfortune of minority groups have to be caused by an oppressive dominant group. The trifecta for this, although there are others, but the main trifecta is the white male heterosexual, although any one of those alone is sufficient to identify a scapegoat. If not for the oppressive systems set up by these malevolent groups, apparently minority groups would have little or no trouble in life. Instead of entertaining the idea that every individual has agency and some responsibility for the quality of their life, the idea of merit is scoffed at. Apparently nothing can change for a struggling minority group until the scapegoat is either destroyed or recruited to their cause. Critical social justice abounds in rhetoric to convince us of this and to shame those considered to be privileged into submission and compliance with their ideology and their demands. Just a reminder, the 20th century saw tens of millions of people killed when they were used as scapegoats to advance political ideologies. Something to think about. The next tactic, ad hominem attacks. Armed with a lexicon of damning epithets and scapegoat groups to pin them on, dialogue and debate can be stopped in its tracks whenever a question is raised or a bit of inconvenient truth is presented. The person is a racist, a misogynist, a transphobe, a fascist, a white supremacist, an Uncle Tom, an apologist for something evil. Not only does this thwart the possibility of constructive conversation, when made publicly, it riles the mob. It leads to doxing, being canceled, being fired from one's job, being investigated, receiving death threats. While this can be a horror for the person experiencing it, it also tends to silence anybody else, terrify anybody else who might have a dissenting or contrary opinion. I believe this also leads to greater and greater division, and those who are remaining silent, instead of feeling shame, may increasingly feel angry, and this could build up over time. And when the possibility of dialogue is continually shut down, I think we get culture wars, which is what we're in right now. And if it continues this way, we can only guess at where it will go, but I don't think any of our guesses are that it goes anyplace good. The last tactic I want to talk about is manipulating emotions. I don't think that this is so much a separate tactic as it is the result of practicing the other things. It's what the other things are aimed at doing. If emotions were not roused and inflamed, they wouldn't be effective at all. So the primary emotions that I see propaganda working on are fear, outrage, guilt/shame, and pride. Now, any attempt to persuade people through rhetoric will involve an appeal to the emotions. And this is not necessarily problematic. It's just part of human communication. We want people to feel things about what we're talking about. The problem is that when emotions are provoked through misleading information and they are amplified and fanned to an intense place, then we have another issue going on. Then they can become a social contagion. They're something that we kind of pick up from those around us, and we share, and we amplify them, and we get in our little echo chambers and intensify these feelings. Evoking and amplifying these feelings becomes a lever for getting people to subscribe to and further your own or your group's ideological agenda. In this sense, it's propaganda. To conclude, I want to offer two metaphors that I think do a good job at illustrating what I've been talking about all along. Don't leave yet, though, because I think these are pretty interesting metaphors that help to simplify things to an image. To set it up, I would ask that you reflect on perhaps the first time you heard the words diversity, equity, and inclusion. What did they mean to you? How did you feel when you heard them? They sound very positive. I know that when I first heard them, they sounded really something I was on board with. To reject them would be an indication of a serious moral deficiency. Who couldn't be for these three things? To not be for diversity, you must be a racist. To not be for equity, you must be anti-justice. For not being for inclusivity, you must really believe that people need to be marginalized. Who could believe that? Nobody, except true bigots. Bring on the trainers and let's get going. Let's learn about this. Let's get on board with this. At some point, for many of us, I know for me, things changed. I saw that these words maybe didn't mean what they advertised themselves to mean. Diversity didn't really mean full diversity. It didn't include perspective and opinion diversity. Equity didn't mean what I thought it would mean, would be equality of opportunity. It began to mean enforced outcomes. Inclusion began to not mean inclusion to me. It meant that in order to make safe spaces for people who might be very sensitive to offense, people had to be excluded from spaces. That those people with the wrong opinions were excluded. The whole thing turned around. It didn't mean what it sounded like. So here's the first metaphor. I began to see critical social justice and its various campaigns as a Trojan horse. At first it appears like a gift. It appears like something desirable. You want to let it in. You let it in, and then it turns out that there are soldiers inside ready to come out and take over. So the first is a Trojan horse. The second one frames things a little bit differently, but it's also very useful, I think. It's called the Mott and Bailey doctrine. And this is based on medieval construction of fortresses, in which one part is on a high elevation, easily defensible. It's like a fortress. That's the Mott. And below it, in a more expansive surrounding area, is the Bailey. It's less defensible. So in applying this to what I've been talking about, the Mott is the first understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's what's easy to defend. It's what most people would agree is true and right. The Bailey is the other stuff, the reductionism to group identity, to binary of oppressed and oppressive groups, and postmodernism and its rejection of objective truth. And the strategy with the Mott and Bailey is that you promote the Mott and then you promote the Bailey, and when the Bailey becomes under attack, you retreat to the Mott. And when the attack dies down, you come back out to the Mott. You come back out to the Bailey, I'm sorry. And in this way, you keep your opponents distracted and confused. And by the way, the Tower of London, here in London down along the Thames, is a good example of the Mott and Bailey construction. I know I've leaned in pretty hard on this critique, looking at propaganda, but I want to reaffirm and reiterate my intention for this series. It's not simply to provide a critique, it's to also preserve the good intentions and the valid points made by critical social justice and as introduced to psychotherapy, form of woke psychotherapy. And toward that end, in my next video, I want to propose a way that critical social justice and woke psychotherapy can be invited and welcome at a table of dialogue and debate, and to make their points, but to make them within a particular context. And that's what I hope, that's what I intend to talk about in my next video. So if you're interested, please join me for that one as well. If you've liked this video, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel, leave me comments, please, and share this video with a friend or anybody you think might be interested. Until next time, be well and take care, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye-bye.